Hi. This morning we're going to be talking about project planning as a kind of a holistic activity, and it's probably not a bad way to think about it. Even as we break it down into the various subplans and everything that is involved in project planning, the process, although often written as linear, is so integrated that, for all intents and purposes, it is one large development that is going on throughout the planning cycle. So certainly within the course, the planning or project planning is going to be a good chunk over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And we will be looking at it at the various skills of the individual subplans and everything else that you need to look at. But before we get there, what we want to do is to have an overall understanding of how the plan should be coming together, because it is the integration of the plan which is fundamentally what the project manager needs to be focused on. They may have individuals, working schedule, making working costs, working procurements, all those things, but ultimately it is the intent of the plan is to integrate the various subplans and to make sure that the project plan is a cohesive whole. So where are we starting? Well, we're starting with the project charter. The project charter has been signed off, and it has a great deal of information, all at the high level, all at the strategic level, but it informs us when it comes to stepping off with the plan. And you look at what's there. I mean, the background, the purpose of the project, fundamental objectives, high level scope assessment, what's in, what's out, what we have to accomplish in order to be successful in the project. Also tells us who our stakeholder or major stakeholders are anyway, who our client is, who the sponsor of the project are. That will inform a lot of the plans that we're going to have to make. It may also include summary milestones, the big overall arching, you need to accomplish this by a certain period of time, which will drive the schedule. And it probably has some kind of a preliminary budget. Now we're going to have to validate that budget as we get more and more refined, but that initial budget arrived at in sort of a larger grosso modo picture is likely passed on in the project charter, and certainly as we validate it, if we're going to beat it, that's great. That should be informed upwards anyway. But if we're going to have challenges meeting that budget, then we need to have a conversation with the sponsor. And constraints, assumptions, fundamental identified risks, all of that, that's all in the project charter. So we have a wealth of information which is going to help us as we set off to start the planning for our project. Basically what this is saying, it makes a big deal about that initial meeting, kicking it off, getting everything going in the right direction. Certainly, if I look at strategic planning exercises and that I've participated in my life, it was really, really important in order to bring in the senior executives 1 and 2 levels up to give their vision, to make sure that our vision was linked and lined up with what they're doing. Starting a project is not that different from that. And quite frankly, you should have your project sponsor or some other high corporate executive there to lay the groundwork and to make sure that the project team is starting off in the direction that was envisioned by the corporation, which empowered the project team to set up when they signed the project charter. So it starts at a high level, and then it should start to flush out all of that information that we saw in the project charter. So set the right tone and start to develop that information. Don't drive into the weeds in the first meeting, but certainly start to see where the challenges are going to be, where the intricacies are going to be, where the interdependencies are going to be, so that you know when you can be working in isolation and when you need to be working together. So one thing worth noting is that depending on the governance structure of the project and whether you're working for outside clients or if it's just an internal project, it changes some of the control issues associated with the project, then that should all be obvious within the project charter. So if you're working for an outside client, then clearly the client has an interest in, if not outright control over the budget. And so you have to be aware of what those control structures are. Certainly scope changes. If there's a client, you're going to have to be able to have a change control process that is going to make sure that the client is on board with the changes as well. Or if you're not able to come forward with a early foreseen deliverable and stuff like that. So where there's an outside client, make sure you have a close look at what the governance structures are, how the stakeholder engagement is going to work, so that you know what is your authority, what is the sponsor's authority versus what is the client's authority to make changes. So this is the meat of it. Let's get into planning. So this is out of the pin box. So this is that column out of that table that we saw early on in the introduction to project management. This is the process group that they refer to as planning. And it's the bulk of what you're going to spend your time doing, certainly in the next little while. It's complicated. Of course, it spans the 10 knowledge areas. Those are the horizontal rows, remember, from that table. And covers the gamut of just about everything that you need to do in order to get your project ready to roll off. So let's identify some of what it is and, of course, some of what it isn't. So for the most part, when they talk about writing the plan is how you intend to plan it in many ways, or those are the overarching bits. So develop project management plan. It's how am I going to plan it? What tools and techniques are we going to engage in order to make sure that our project is successful? And this, drives a lot of the sub-plans where it says, oh, we're going to use this technique. We're going to do that. We're going to estimate using a 3-variable estimation process. However it is that you're going to do it. Of course, a lot of this is going to be based on your past experience or input from your team. But much of what we say in the plan is not the what, but the how. So it also includes not just kind of the integrating plan, because that top level plan is the integrating plan of all the subsidiary plans. So it includes an annex or an appendix on each of the subsidiary plans. And again, because they are plans, they are how, not the what. So one of the subsidiary plans would be, say, stakeholder engagement. So how are you going to engage the stakeholders? What kind of a communication program are you going to have? What kind of a PR campaign will surround it? How will you be doing that rather than the what? So what are those subsidiary plans? Well, if you look down this chart, this column, we see the top line in each of the knowledge areas is labeled plan. So we have plan scope management, plan schedule management, plan cost management, plan quality management. These are all the subsidiary plans that are incorporated into the planning process group. So you would expect to see an appendix for each of these that would lay out how you are going to do each of those within the project. Now, it doesn't end there, because knowing how you're going to do things isn't really good enough. It's not going to get the project done. So we do need to figure out the what. And so these what we're going to do really fall to the baselines. And we typically talk about the 3 baselines that come out of the project planning process. And those deal with our 3 from our iron triangle: scope, schedule, and cost. And so we have a scope baseline, a schedule baseline, and a cost baseline. Now, it is worth noting, and again, you have to go back to your governance structure and remember all of this is scalable. So depending on what your size of project is and how it's configured within your organization, some of this may apply or not. But typically, Once you arrive at your baselines, your scope, schedule, and cost baselines, and they are all agreed to by the various players within your project, so your sponsor, client, if you have one, that type of thing, they become control documents. And now we don't change them anymore without an approved change request. And so controlling that becomes a really important thing to do. But it also means we want to have these things pretty well nailed down before we move forward into the next step. Because if we're going to agree to it, we don't want to have a whole bunch of changes just because we didn't get it right. So what are these baselines? So let's start at the first baseline, so our scope baseline. So that next three lines under plan, scope, management. And this is where we reiterate our scope statement, making sure that we're very detailed as far as what is included in the scope of the project and specifically what is excluded in the scope of the project so that there is no miscommunication whatsoever. And it is from this that we then start to grow the work breakdown structure. Now, the work breakdown structure dictionary is simply a lexicon of anything that is required to explain what is going into the work breakdown structure, which happens more often than not. But fundamentally, at the end of the scope baseline, or what fundamentally makes up the scope baseline, other than the statement of the dictionary, is this work breakdown structure. And we'll talk at some length in this particular video about the work breakdown structure, what it is, and how to arrive at it. Then we have the schedule baseline. So this is, for me, a lot of fun as a construction person. Spending time delivering the schedule baseline can be a great deal of fun. And so this is where we're going to define and sequence our activities. So where do we get those activities? Of course, the activities are coming from the work breakdown structure. So there we feed from one into the next. And if we can fully define and then sequence our activities, we have fundamentally established the network diagram for the project. Now, if we add to that and through all of this, we're going to, like I say, remember, this is all integrated. We're showing it as linear, we're showing them as isolated, but they are, in effect, all going on together. We have to estimate our activity durations. And once we've estimated our activity durations, and we know the interdependencies and the relationships from our network diagram, we can actually go ahead and start to establish our initial schedule and develop the schedule. And so what we would hope to come out of this exercise, for the most part, we're starting to get towards having a Gantt chart. And you look down the list, it says estimate activity resources. Well, clearly we can't go from a network diagram to a completed schedule without estimating our activity resources and getting those identified, because of course you're going to have resources that are not available at certain times because of interdependencies with other projects, or they're going to be assigned to one task when they could be assigned to a different task. And so all of that has to happen, but it's going to be happening iteratively. Your first schedule likely will not include any resource implications, and we're going to look at resources as a further refinement to that and start to make the Gantt chart look more like it's going to carry us through to fruition. Finally, our third baseline is the cost baseline. So having arrived with our work packages from the work breakdown structure, now what we need to do is we need to figure out what the estimates are associated with it. How much is it going to cost to deliver on each of those? And quite often, how much it's going to cost is integrated with how long it's going to take. And so you can't separate cost from duration. They have to be considered at the same time, certainly in my sector. And from that, you can start to get your cost per activity. And from the cost per activity, you can start to develop your budget timeline or your cash flow as it flows out over the timeline for the project. And this is the basis upon which we start to build the budget. So integral to this, if we go further down and we look at risk management, which is yet to happen. So we have to bring forward what the costs are associated with managing those risks, and they have to go into our contingency reserve, because we don't get a budget without the contingency reserve. The contingency reserve is built into that cost baseline, and then we have the management reserve, which flushes it out to come to the overall budget. The only question I have from this all makes perfect sense to me as somebody who's gone through this process several times. They don't normally refer to the risk register, which clearly has to come out of the planning. If we look down at the knowledge area of plan risk management and the various risks under that, and we're going to be looking at risk management, it's a big part of this. And it strikes me as kind of interesting that they don't list the risk register as one of the baselines or one of the product outputs as part of this plan, but clearly it is. It's not normally listed, so I don't know why that is, but you're going to have to deliver it, and if you want to think of it as something that we do here, that's probably not a bad thing, because it has to be done integrated with all of these other steps, otherwise the other steps are not informed. So what are our objectives then when it comes to delivering the plan? So the first objective has to be to define and integrate the plans. The overall plan, its sole purpose is to integrate all of the subplans and to make sure that the project is going to unfold as a harmony of effort as compared to a bunch of individuals going off in their own direction as to how they think things should be happening, and nothing bringing it together as a collective effort. So as we talked about in the last slide, there's a number of key outputs. The plan itself, which is that integration piece, all of the subsidiary plans, and we'll once again come to the baselines again. So, you know, we talked about it in the scope management, clear objective terms of what is and what is not included in the project. I'm reiterating this again because so often we can go wrong if there is any confusion whatsoever as to what bounds the project. And so we want to get that right. A good project scope statement, good scope baseline, and ultimately it'll lead to a requirements matrix. So the baselines, if you will, are the courses of action. There's a lot of decisions to be made as we develop those baselines. Whether it's at the task level, how am I going to do this task? I can do this task because I can contract it out. I could do this task because I'm going to do it with local labor and maybe rent some equipment to support them. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do things, and as well as an overarching plan as to how we're going to achieve things. So there are a lot of decisions to be made as we build the baselines. And the schedule baseline, cost baseline, resource requirements, that's your scope baseline for all intents and purposes. And all of this goes back down to the first step, which is developing the work breakdown structure. And we didn't talk a lot about it because it's not often referred to in that context, but certainly the risk management process happens during the planning cycle and needs to be integrated into those baselines. And so you don't want to lose that. It is as important as all of them. And the other thing that needs to be considered in all of this is that you need to identify how the project is going to be managed and controlled. Even as we will talk about when we get to the work breakdown structure, you have to account for the tasks of managing and controlling the project and make sure that those are scheduled in and around the tasks that are delivering on the project itself. So in some detail then, these are the subsidiary plans that need to be integrated into that initial plan. So you know, it's probably your first time seeing this, so it's worth going through them, I guess, line by line. So your scope management plan, we've already talked a little bit about. Your schedule management plan. How are you going to schedule? Remember, this is the how. How are you going to schedule? Are you going to be using PERT? Are you going to be using bottom-up, top-down? How are you going to develop that schedule? What techniques are you going to use? Are you going to run a Monte Carlo simulation in order to feed into the overall project risk? There's lots that can go into that cost management plan. How are you going to do your estimates? Again, top up, bottom down. Are you going to use parametric estimating? What are the techniques that you plan to use based on your experience to make sure that this project, based on its nature, is being set up to be successful and come on target or be completed on budget and on time? Resource management plan. How are you going to manage your resources? Are the internal resources, purchasing, acquisitions? There's a whole bunch of things that go into that. Your communication plan. How are you going to be updating your information, managing that information, doing your analysis, updating your stakeholders, updating your executive? There's a whole raft of communications that has to go on, and this should lay out your plan for that communication. Your risk management plan, we're going to talk about that in a great deal, so I'm just going to skim over it right now because it is one of the ones that will be covered later on. Procurement management plan. How are you going to do your procurements? What is your processes that you're going to apply to doing the process, to doing the procurements? Who's deciding on which procurement methodology is going to be taken for each item that you need to acquire? Of course, the stakeholder management plan, really important to manage the various stakeholders. Stakeholders come proactive and on side, and stakeholders come actively trying to work against the project. So you have a whole bunch of different stakeholders. You need to have a plan on how you're going to manage those stakeholders to leverage those that are working on your behalf and hopefully mitigating some of the challenges from those stakeholders that don't see the project as friendly. Now, I've given a bit of a space here, and that space here is because those are the plans, the subsidiary plans that show up within the planning group or the process group that we already looked at. Depending on the literature you're looking at, other plans are often referred to change management plan, process improvement plan, configuration management plan. Certainly those, change management plan has to be done. You need to know how you're going to be managing changes, who's on your board to review the change requests, how they're going to get reviewed. So I throw these in here as potential plans that you may want to include as appendices and just isolate them because they weren't listed in the previous list. So we talked about the three baselines. So this is, how you're going to do the job. This is actually how you're going to deliver the deliverables of the project. And we see the scope, work breakdown structure, the dictionary, the scope statement. We see the schedule. We spend a lot of time working on the schedule, and that never stops. And of course, the cost. And that should lead you to that time phase budget or the cash flow requirements over time of the project. You don't need all the money up front. You need some of the money up front. You need it to come and replenish your accounts periodically through the project. And so you have to deliver that cash flow needs as part of your cost estimate. Yeah, and they're typically based on work package estimates. But how are you going to do the estimates? What methodologies are you going to use to do them? But here in the baseline, it's not about how, that was in your plan. This is about the estimates themselves, complete with all the uncertainties associated with each of the estimates so that the risks associated with each one can be assessed separately. And speaking of risks, your contingency reserve is the reserve that you need to cost to manage the risks identified for the project. And we'll deal with how we get to that more when we're looking at risk management. But that cost is part of the cost baseline, is the cost necessary to manage the identified risks associated with the project. Now, occasionally they talk about a fourth baseline as the performance measurement, and it just seems to pop in here and there every once in a while. I've seen some people refer to it as the sum of the scope, schedule, and cost, because that's principally how you're going to be measured. There may be some other people that refer to other things. For the most part, I will normally refer to the three project baselines. But if you do see a fourth one referred to, this is typically what they're talking about. So let's talk about the work breakdown structure. So what is it? So first off, the work breakdown structure is it's hierarchical. right? So we normally take our project and we have this one giant amorphous mass of you need to deliver this. And what we have to do is to start breaking it down into successively smaller chunks that comprise the project. Things that we have to do. And, I think in terms of construction, well, if you're going to ultimately deliver on a new building, you probably have to do excavation work and land work. You probably have to be working with the developer to make sure the various utilities and everything are delivered to the site. You probably have foundational work. You have exterior work or the structural work, and then you have exterior cladding work. Now you're into the more details of interior work and utilities within that. It doesn't matter what the project is. The work breakdown structure is this hierarchical breakdown of successively smaller tasks. We normally use a tree structure to represent it, and so that makes a certain visual sense when we see it laid out. And the purpose is to identify, eventually, as we break it into smaller and smaller tasks, the actual work packages or activities that have to be done to complete the project and serve as the basis of our planning and our scheduling and estimating and everything else. So we need to identify major task categories. Then we have to go down to subtasks and subtasks. Eventually, we want to use a verb-noun action item. This isn't absolutely essential, but it certainly works for me that in each of these activities, if it's an activity, we should be doing something. We should be, building something, digging something, painting something, programming something, coding something. At every step, once we get down to the actual activity tasks, we want to have some kind of active verb-noun combination. Lots of examples, getting up in the morning, hit the snooze button again, get out of bed, avoid the dog, go to the bathroom. Anyway, lots of silly things we can do to break down our activities into things that we actually have to do and can schedule. So creating a work breakdown structure, remember it's a decomposition of project deliverables and activities into smaller, more manageable parts. Again, we mentioned earlier that it should be, or typically is done in a tree structure. The lowest level in the work breakdown structure, so kind of orange in the graphic that's on this slide, is the work packages based on the statement of work. And so if we can get to the bottom and do all of the orange level activities, then our project is going to be finished. It is usually the basis for all of our estimating. It's usually the basis of our scheduling. It's usually the basis of our resource allocations. All of these activities, when done, will result in the success of the project. Now, a couple things, those activities, so we're getting down to those work packages, need to be smart. And we've all heard the term smart before. When it comes to giving personnel their assignments or their goals for a given year. So SMART is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And that, it's kind of a buzzword, makes sense. To me, when I look at my work breakdown structure, what drives my thinking in do I have it sufficiently refined or do I have it over refined is it schedulable at that work package level, and is it costable? Can I estimate it? And if I can do those two things, I'm probably getting pretty close to the level of refinement that I need in order to do my next task, which is to schedule it. So I came across a term not so long ago, says needs to be MIS. And of course, that's two words, mutually exclusive. Absolutely, they all have to stand alone. If a work package is still overlapping with other work packages, then it becomes really complicated as far as scheduling and everything else goes. So mutually exclusive is not a bad way to test to see if you've got the refinement in your work breakdown structure that you need. The other one is completely exhaustive. if everything isn't finished at the end of it, if you do all of those packages and there's still stuff to do, then you haven't got enough information. You've missed things. And so it has to completely exhaust the work required to do the project. The one thing that a lot of people leave out, and you'll even see that coming up, is don't forget the task to manage the project. You have tasks. You have absolutely essential critical tasks, and your team have absolutely essential critical tasks that they need to do in order to manage the project, which has to be integrated and timed with the actual deliverables or activities associated with the project itself. So those should be done. So you probably need a subtask, which is project management, which has a series of tasks below that. So how would we normally see it laid out? You probably have at the top level is the project, and then you might have major tasks within the project, subtasks within the major tasks, and ultimately, however many levels you need, get down to the activities or the work packages that need to be completed. And we normally number them in that way. So everything that belongs to, say, a major task number 2 will get numbered, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and whatnot. And if there's subtasks to that, 2.11, 2.12, 2.13, so that they all make this cohesive sense, whether seen as a list or seen as as a diagram, as a tree diagram. Now, the reality is the tree diagram is absolutely fantastic when it comes to developing it, brainstorming it, working it, that team process to make sure that it is done. But the reality is that once it is developed, you're probably going to start working it in lists and on spreadsheets because the structure would be it would be too constraining if you're always working in the tree structure after that. So let's look at an example. So here we have a simple work breakdown structure for a gas station construction project that you might be doing. Build the gas station. Again, we see packaging and service areas, building the shell wall, electrical systems, exterior finishes, foundation, interior floors, building floors, and then each one is then broken down into a number of simple tasks. And if we've broken it down enough, we've gotten down to schedulable, costable work packages that we can put into our schedule and deliver the project. So I can critique this one on a couple of sets. So let me move that out of the way and bring up my critique. So a couple things. First off, the activities should use active terms. We talked about that on a previous slide. So you should be painting something, building something, constructing, erecting, digging. We should be a little bit more active in the actual activities once we get down to the bottom. And I noticed that there's no management tasks laid out in this particular tree. So there's probably needs a subtask called project management, and that should allow for a number of tasks which can be integrated into all of these other tasks. So if we look down, so let's take one of these activities, one of these work packages out of the work breakdown structure and talk about what ultimately is going to be developed as part of it. And again, remember this whole process is iterative and integrated and repeated. So not all of this information is necessarily going to come out right away, but it ultimately all is often usually needed. So what is to be done? Scope. There's absolutely no doubt that each of these work packages need to be very specific as to what needs to be done within each of them. It says, when is it to be started and finished? And eventually we're going to get there. We are not going to get there as part of the work breakdown structure. We're going to get to that point of refinement when it comes to the schedule. However, what you need to know at this stage anyway is how long is it going to take? Now, to get to how long it's going to take, you have to start making choices as to how you're actually going to achieve it. Think of the iteration now. You choose because this should be done. Most of this should be done in my world anyway. Again, and the textbook does a good job of the various ways to approach this: bottom up, top down, all of that. In my world, I would normally expect the shop foreman, supervisor, that is responsible for a particular work package to be working on a lot of this detail associated with it. And they're going to have to feed up to me what they think they need in time. But in order to feed up what they think they need in time, they may need to make choices about how they're going to achieve it. Are they doing it with in-house resources? Are they hiring a contractor to get it done? Are they bringing in additional labor to do it and providing a supervisor? There are a number of choices, and all of those choices will change both the cost and the time estimate to achieve that work package. Keep in mind, and this again, we're thinking about the iterations here, they will make choices. They will make a plan based on some choices, which may not be feasible based on the interdependencies of this project, other tasks in this project, or other projects that are interdependent. And so, their initial plan may not be the plan that we end up in the end. So anyway, we need to not necessarily know at this stage, start and finish, but we definitely need to know what is the duration based on the method that you're planning to use. Who's going to do it? Again, making choices, making assumptions, and be prepared for assumptions to be wrong. It's actually a great lesson here because assumptions are so often wrong in project management, whereas in other disciplines we make an assumption and we forget about them and we don't go back to them. But yeah, so who's going to do it? What are the fundamental resources? And we'll talk about resource leveling and resource scheduling and everything else later. But at this stage, it's like, okay, this is what I need in order to deliver this package in this amount of time. And what needs to be done? What is the context around my work package? What needs to be done before I get here? What needs to follow shortly after or immediately after this work package is finished? So some sequential perspective as to where it fits into the other tasks within the work breakdown structure. It's possible that some activities may be done simultaneously. That doesn't necessarily have to come out here. If you identify what has to be done before it, what has to be done after it, as the schedule indicates things, it will allow for the schedule to keep things simultaneously. And if there are other constraints because of space limitations and stuff like that, then you can start to force those in. So lots to go on. Many things have to happen when and how they're supposed to happen to make it all come together. And this is where we're going to build up that information. As I've kind of been building the context that everything's uncertain. We're making decisions, we're making assumptions, we're providing information back in, but it is one or the initial step of a cyclic process where we expect to have several iterations as we change those assumptions, modify them to allow for integration into the other tasks, and we consider the risks associated with the decisions that we've made. This is our gas station example, once again, broken down, and this is just a snippet out of Excel. So I'm actually a real fan of doing my work breakout structure in Excel rather than in Microsoft Project. I find in Microsoft Project you get drawn into considering scheduling and all those other things before you're ready. By working in Excel, we can actually gather most of the information and try to do it in our little shell, our little space, our work package, and allow the integration to look at the integration later on. Sometimes when we get ahead of ourselves, we start to impose constraints that don't actually logically exist, but they did in our mind when we were looking at it. So that's one of the reasons why I like Excel. Keep in mind that you can copy and paste this into the table in Microsoft Project and it'll build everything. So you're not losing any work. It's just a choice of keeping yourself a little bit isolated from the imposition of the schedule. So if we look at any one, So let's say exterior utilities, it's got a duration 12 days, it identifies the resources it needs to do it in 12 days. Well, clearly they've made a decision. We're going to use these resources, and based on these resources, it's going to take that long. Well, if we change the resources, we're going to change the duration. If we need a different duration, maybe if we can achieve it by changing the resources. So this is where this has to be a flexible, moldable first step. And it is absolutely essential to identify the precedents. What activities need to be done before it? What activities should immediately follow it, if any? Normally we talk about precedents. What does it have to follow? And then other activities will say, well, what has to follow it? And this might be one of those. And so that will build the network overall. And so that falls out, in this case, into immediate precedence based on the task number. And that, if you do it up in this format here, the nice thing is that you can throw that directly into Microsoft Project and it will build your network for you. So other activities, so we've been talking about the work package, a couple other activities that you might see. They're logical activities. First off, a milestone. It's a zero time, zero resource activity, which basically is a phase gate that is going to allow you to achieve this. It represents that you've come to an end of a subtask or something like that. And so it's a logical gate that you're trying to work towards in your other tasks. And then you may have dummy activities. In order to build your network, not all of the activities are interconnected all the time. And so you may come up with a dummy activity, like quite often you'll see a start. Quite often there's many activities that can actually be started simultaneously at the start of a project, but you need a dummy activity to connect your network and get it all flowing through. And so you come up with a dummy activity. So a couple other comments. I think we've exhausted work breakdown structure. It is useful to create a table that shows the staff needed to execute the work breakdown structure tasks. And one approach is an organizational breakdown structure where you have your organization and you assign the task to the organization or to the people. And that should start to tell you who's going to be responsible for each of these tasks, who must approve any changes in the scope, and who must be notified of the progress of the individual tasks. Now, work breakdown structure and organizational breakdown structure may or may not be identical depending on how the organization is structured. So one tool that is often referred to is the responsibility matrix, or the RACI matrix. It's another approach to doing responsibility and assigning tasks, and it allows you to control a very diverse group of people carrying out work on behalf of the project. So there's a number of terminologies that people use to refer to the RACI matrix, responsibility matrix, linear responsibility chart, any number of those. And it shows the critical interfaces with individuals or people or organizations and the tasks that they are assigned. And it keeps track of who must approve and who must be notified with changes in various activities. So here, a sample, easiest to look at. And so you have the activities listed down the left-hand side and the various organizations or individuals across the right. And so for each task and subtask, and you see them all listed out here, individuals can be tasked to either be accountable for the task. Somebody needs to be accountable for the task. Somebody may be responsible for doing the task. And other people need to be consulted about the task if there's any changes or issues associated with the task. And other people simply need to be informed. And if you don't fill into any of those categories, then there's a blank. And so this keeps a fairly comprehensive table of who's responsible for what, who's accountable for what, who should be informed when something is changing, and is considered a really good tool to help with that integration management. So coordinating the work and timing of different groups really is what integration management is all about. any project has quite a few different groups working. Unbeknownst to the other groups, the people working on the project, many of them don't even know about any of the other people working on the project. And so coordinating those multidisciplinary teams working across the span of the project requires some degree of structure. And the Raki matrix is a great way to achieve that structure. And its sole purpose is to be a coordination tool, this integration management method. So I do feel I need to mention Agile. I'm not going to talk about Agile project management in any great detail. I certainly am familiar with it. I've never actually participated as a project manager in an Agile project. Why? Well, my industry really doesn't work in that space. I mean, certainly there are some new methodologies that my industry incorporates, and as you get into the abstract discussion as to how do we categorize those, I certainly have had other people say, well, that really is Agile. Yeah, I'm not convinced, but so Agile comes out of the software development world, works incredibly well for them. Very undefined ends. Well, I can't even say an undefined end state. They have a path towards where they're going, but it's about the path and multiple rollouts along that with their distributed teams and everything else. Anyway, I'm not going to do it justice because, to be fair, it's too easy for you to get a description of Agile from somebody who is familiar with Agile. So anyway, I've, as part of the additional materials, I've put a link to what I thought was a decent 10-minute video that describes what Agile is and how it comes together. And certainly I'll be trying to find an appropriate case study where we can make sure somebody's talking about Agile during the case studies, which will bring up the whole discussion about it and everything else. It certainly is, I won't even say new, it's probably 20 years old, 20, maybe 30 years old now. Methodology in project management, and again, largely out of the software industry. But you should be aware of it and do watch the video. I think it's important. They'll do a better job of describing it than I could. So a little bit about phases and phase gates. In setting up your project, in my industry, we certainly use phases, construction phases. Certainly in construction project management, we use phase gates, and phase gates are review opportunities for us to evaluate whether the project is ready to move into the next phase and ready to be invested in for the next phase. It's always an opportunity to say, no, we're not going to move forward with this, or we're not ready to move forward with this. So using phases and phase gates is something that we do fairly often. And you want to consider whether that's a means that's appropriate to control your project and control reporting, not typically within the project team, but from the project team outwards to the senior management and to the sponsor. So that is what I wanted to say to set the context for project planning. I say set the context in that most of what we talked about, particularly those baselines of cost, schedule, scope, cost, and schedule, we're going to be talking about in great detail. So this is the flow-through integrated plan, which is going to bring all of those together. So hopefully, you've got an idea of how that integration and flow, that iterative back and forth might be happening, so that when we get into talking about the details, you don't think it's like fire and forget and, it stands alone. It stands as a repeated task within the flow of the overall project plan. So hopefully that was helpful. There are a number of extra little videos, mine or others, that I've thrown in as additional material, and we're going to jump right in and start looking at some of the deliverables for project planning.